Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Izabella Rogers. I am a human physiology major, and my project is entitled CAMP, which stands for Challenges for Autistic Middle Schoolers Post-Pandemic. My research question is, what were the experiences and challenges of children with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, upon returning to in-person learning after a period of remote learning? Autism is on a spectrum with symptoms ranging from mild to severe. I was diagnosed with ASD in middle school, and some of the symptoms that I have are difficulty making eye contact, sensory overload, and anxiety. I was also very delayed with language and went to speech therapy. There hasn't been a lot of research on this topic yet, but we do know that prior studies focused specifically on the period of remote learning rather than the period following remote learning. And they found that mental health was severely impacted. And one study that did examine the latter used questionnaires rather than interviews. My study has 3 aims. The first one is to capture the experience of kids with ASD during remote learning. The second one is to capture their experience returning to school after a period of remote learning. And aim 3 was to determine how the remote learning experience of a kid with ASD relates to their ability to readapt to in-person learning. My participants were parents of 7 children aged 12 to 16 diagnosed with ASD. And I focused on middle school age children because that is a very pivotal time in one's life. We could think about puberty, for example. And I included all levels of verbal ability, so we have nonverbal, minimally verbal, and verbal. I had my participants fill out 3 surveys, and these were just meant to characterize my sample size. So the first one was a demographic survey. The second one was the Social Responsiveness Scale, or the SRS, and it measures autism severity. It's widely used by researchers in the field. And the third one was the Parent-Rated Anxiety Scale, and that is specific to children with ASD. It's also widely used. For my interviews, I asked about school day during the pandemic, typical morning routine, change in sleeping or eating, academic performance, and new or worsening anxiety. I then qualitatively coded and analyzed these interviews. Moving on to some demographics. I just want to highlight a couple of things here. I did only have 1 female participant, which makes sense because we know that males are more likely to be diagnosed with ASD. And for verbal status, I split my participants into 2 groups, minimally and nonverbal, and verbal. Here are the SRS scores. The values are in no specific order here. And the orange line is the cutoff for a diagnosis of ASD, while the red line is the cutoff for severe autism. And we can see that the average SRS score in my sample is very high, which is considered severe ASD. In addition, my sample did not have a lot of variation, which did affect my results. And here are the Parent-Rated Anxiety Scale scores. These are also in no specific order. And researchers use different cutoffs, but the one I'm using here is 45, and that's that red line for a diagnosis of anxiety. And we can see that the scores here were much more varied. Moving on to the experience of remote learning. So this chart compares children by verbal status. So we can see that 100% of the kids who were minimally or nonverbal were easily distracted from online learning, while only 25% of the kids who were verbal were easily distracted. So having a lower verbal ability was associated with being more easily distracted from Zoom learning. And we can think of things like toys or video games as being possible distractions. Here are some quotes about school day during the pandemic. I'll give you a few seconds to read those. Then I'll read out the ones in dark blue. We had a timetable of getting him up at a certain time, making sure that each class was attended and that the Zoom worked. So oftentimes kids with ASD do much better when they have a set routine, so this parent tried to minimize a change in routine as much as possible. There were distractions in his room with all his toys, so that was hard. And moving on to the experience of returning to in-person learning, here are some quotes about typical morning routine. I think he was excited to go back, so it was easy to transition back to the way it was pre-pandemic. Returning to school was tough. I had to fight with him every morning to get up. He refused to go to school. And these quotes really show the variability in responses. Some kids had no issues going back to school whatsoever, while others simply refused to even wake up for school. I found that kids with more severe autism or higher SRS scores were more likely to eat more foods upon returning to school. And this is an interesting finding because we know that kids with ASD tend to be picky eaters at baseline sometimes. So we could say that severe ASD was associated with a more diverse diet. And here are some quotes about eating habits. Being at home, he had more access to ready-made food. He tried other foods during the pandemic, so he eats better now. This parent noted that because their child was at home all day, they were able to eat a larger variety of meals. In turn, the child ate much better when they returned to school. And this was a case with a large portion of the children. And here are some quotes about academic performance. I was pretty convinced in middle school that he couldn't write, and now he has to write all the time. He was always smart, but he'd sit there and not even pick up a pencil. He went from a substantially separate classroom to full integration with very little support. And the theme here is that kids with ASD received far less support upon returning to school as opposed to before the pandemic. While this was a positive change for some children, those who truly needed the support were unable to get it. And one of the possible reasons for this is the continuing shortage of special education staff. These graphs show that 100% of the kids with social anxiety had a disruption of morning routine, while only 25% of the kids without social anxiety had a disruption of morning routine. So social anxiety was associated with a disruption of morning routine, so maybe they had more trouble getting up in the morning or getting ready. And these graphs show that 67% of kids with social anxiety had a change in sleeping habits, while none of the kids without social anxiety had a change in sleeping habits. So social anxiety was associated with a change in sleeping habits, such as staying up later or having trouble getting up in the morning. And here are some quotes about anxiety. He tends to think he's doing worse than he is. He comes home and says he's failing everything. He was terrified because he hadn't seen these kids in a year, and so he was very afraid to go back. So nearly across the board, parents reported an increase in anxiety upon returning to in-person learning, and one of the big contributors of that was social anxiety. And here are some key takeaways. Kids with ASD received less support upon returning to in-person learning. They tended to diversify their diet upon returning to school, and they developed higher levels of social anxiety, which was associated with changes in morning routine and sleeping habits. And I'd like to say thank you to the entire team at CARE, especially my amazing advisor and mentor, Dr. Tager Flussberg, and graduate student Meredith, and of course, all of the families that made my research possible. Thank you.
We'll have a brief Q&A period if anyone has any questions.
That was a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you about, in terms of the families and participants that you spoke with, did they ever speak about anything concerning, like during the Zoom classes, how the either nonverbal or limited verbal students were supported during the Zoom process, or if they were at all?
They weren't to the extent that they should have been. A lot of families mentioned that they would have one-on-one time with a teacher or para or something like that for only 15 minutes out of the whole day, and then the rest of the day the child was just not able to engage at all. So that was something that they really struggled with. And other families also were able to, sometimes their child was able to go in for a certain portion of the day and receive one-on-one interaction like that, but it was not enough.
Congratulations on a great presentation. I was wondering a little bit about the timeline of your data gathering. How much after a return to in-person learning were you able to interview these parents? So were you kind of looking at the first initial months after Zoom learning, or a little bit further out from that time period?
It was a retrospective study, so I started interviewing parents last summer, I believe, and I was asking them to look back, first of all, in the period of remote learning, and then going back to school. So the fall of 2020, I think, is when a lot of them went back.
Any other questions? Fantastic. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.